Every single country in the world has at least one invasive species, and these plants and animals can cause massive damages to the ecosystem and infrastructure. In some very rare cases, invasive species take the danger up to the next level, as some have claimed the lives of humans. In today's video, we'll be traveling around the world to take a look at some of the deadliest invasive animals in the world, as we'll be ranking each of the 7 continents by their deadliest invasive species. We'll be judging the animals based on how deadly they are to humans, and unfortunately we'll be starting off somewhere that's very familiar for regular viewers. Because Antarctica is so harsh and unforgiving, it's almost impossible for any non-native animals to scrape out a living here. The only other animals that could really thrive here are animals that are from the Arctic, but it would be almost impossible for them to migrate to the other side of the planet. Despite the harsh conditions, some non-native animals have been found here, but they aren't exactly a threat to humans. The non-native species in Antarctica mostly come in the form of marine creatures such as mussels and barnacles, and tiny invertebrates such as mites and springtails. These creatures don't really have the capacity to end a human life, and for this reason, Antarctica comes in at a disappointing yet unsurprising 7th place. Europe has a wide range of problem invasive species, but the majority of these animals are relatively small. In its freshwaters, there are invaders from both North and South America such as sunfish and crayfish, and semi-aquatic mammals such as nutria, muskrats, North American beavers, and mink. Now, one man was killed by a beaver in Europe back in 2013, but the beaver responsible was a native beaver and not the North American beaver. Some of the largest invasive species in Europe are deer, and there are actually a few different deer species that can be found here. You'd think that these animals would not be a threat to humans as they are naturally timid, but the stags can be dangerous when they feel threatened, and they can cause human fatalities when they are hit by cars. Of course, the outcome isn't great for the deer either, and it's estimated that around 300 people are killed by deer collisions each year in Europe. One of the largest species that can be found in Europe is the white-tailed deer, which is the most common deer species across North America. They were introduced into Finland in the 1930s, and recent estimates have their population at around 110,000 to 120,000. Surprisingly, the deadliest invaders in Europe aren't giant mammals, as instead they are a group of creatures that are much smaller. Asian hornets are often portrayed as being much more dangerous than they actually are, but they do have the potential to end human lives. There have been a few separate cases where different Asian hornet species have been spotted across Europe, with there being a few documented cases in Spain in 2025. These insects are very bad news for the native species such as bees, but if you manage to really annoy them, then they could end your life too. Some Asian hornet species are deadlier than others, with the Japanese giant hornet being the deadliest. Thankfully for both the bees and the people of Europe, these insects are yet to be found here, but others such as the yellow-legged hornet are present. A sting from these insects will be painful and nothing more in the vast majority of cases, but if you go into anaphylactic shock or if you get stung by a few hornets, then an attack can prove to be fatal. The vast majority of non-native animals in Europe aren't really going to threaten your life, but the danger of hitting a deer or getting stung by Asian hornets means that Europe slots in at 6th place. Asia has a wide range of deadly animals that can't be found anywhere else in the world, and it also has a wide range of deadly species that have invaded other continents. Because many of Asia's ecosystems rank as some of the most competitive in the world, it's very hard for non-native species to establish themselves here. That's why most of the invaders come in the form of domestic animals and fish, but there's one invader here that's mostly famous for conquering another part of the planet. Cane toads are usually one of the first animals that people think of when they imagine an invasive species, but these amphibians got their reputation because of what they have done in Australia and not Asia. They were originally introduced into Australia to control cane beetle populations, but they had a massive negative effect on native predators because their toxins were potent enough to kill them. Thankfully, because it's been over 90 years since they were first introduced, many of the native predators have learnt to avoid them, and some have even discovered a way to prey on them without getting a deadly dose of poison. There are still thought to be an estimated 200 million cane toads in Australia today, and they have a pretty big distribution across Asia too. Because they are such a big problem around the world, there have been many attempts and studies to find an effective way to control them. But in the past, people have resorted to just hitting them with hammers. At first, this sounds like a brutal but not particularly dangerous way to dispose of them. But back in 2005, a woman went temporarily blind because some of the cane toad's poison squirted in her eye. Because cane toads are poisonous and not venomous, the only real way that they can kill you is if you try to eat them. This is why they are particularly dangerous in Asia, as in many countries, native frogs and toads are commonly eaten. This means that all it takes is one unlucky person to misidentify the cane toad as a native species, and then they'll soon have a meeting with the Grim Reaper. One of the most recent cases took place back in 2017, when a South Korean man died after mistaking a cane toad for an edible bullfrog. In Asia, the native species are far more dangerous than the invasive ones, and unless you try to eat them or hit them with a hammer, the cane toads aren't going to kill you. For this reason, Asia slots in at number 5. And if you aren't an expert in identifying amphibians, then it might not be a great idea to eat them. North America has an extremely long list of invaders that come from every corner of the globe, and unsurprisingly, most of them currently reside in Florida. Across the continent, you can find large mammals that belong in Asia and Africa, and even its surrounding waters have been infiltrated by marine predators that decimate the fry of many native fish. Because Florida has a humid, subtropical climate, many animals from warmer parts of the world are able to survive here, whereas they'd likely perish in colder states and Canada. This is why there are so many non-native reptiles that can be found here, and there are a few obvious directions that this section could go. Some of you might be thinking that I'm about to go into great detail about how there are Nile crocodiles in the Everglades and how they are the deadliest crocodile in the world to humans. But the original population that was spotted here between 2009 and 2014 was very small, and since the initial discovery, no other Nile crocodiles have been found. Another possible direction would be to talk about the elephant in the room, which actually turns out to be a snake, as one of the most successful invaders in Florida is the Burmese python. Even though these reptiles have killed and eaten people across their native range, nobody has been killed by a wild Burmese python in Florida. There have also been sightings of anacondas in Florida's wetlands, but despite how they're portrayed in popular media, there has never been a confirmed case where an anaconda has killed and eaten a human. The deadliest invasive species in North America can be found in both the swamps of Florida and the cold northern forests of Canada, and it's an animal that's almost impossible to completely control. Wild hog is generally a term that's used to describe animals that are part feral pig and part wild boar, and they have been causing massive problems across North America. Population estimates for the whole continent are hard to come by, but there are an estimated 6 million across the US alone. They can cause massive problems by competing with native species and destroying farmland, but the native large predators are more than happy to chow down on them. Across Eurasia, in the wild boar's native range, you'll often hear stories about how aggressive these animals can be if they feel threatened or when they're protecting their young. As their population grows across North America, attacks are becoming more common, but fatalities are still relatively rare. One of the more brutal cases took place in Texas in 2019, when a woman was killed by a group of hogs on her driveway. So even though wild hogs kill more people than sharks, you'd still be very unfortunate to lose your life to one, and that's why North America slots in at number 4. You could argue that out of all of the continents around the world, Oceania's wildlife has been worst affected by invasive species. Oceania is mostly made up of small to medium-sized islands, and island ecosystems are extremely vulnerable to invasive species. Countries such as New Zealand had no native land mammals apart from bats, so when non-native mammals were introduced, it caused the extinction of many animals that weren't found anywhere else in the world. Because many of Oceania's islands were also colonized by the Europeans, many European and American species were introduced. European rabbits and foxes caused extinctions and changed the Australian ecosystem as a whole, and in New Zealand, 8 different species of deer were introduced. The moose was easily the most dangerous animal that could be found here, but these animals are thought to be long gone, even though some people cling on to the hope that some have survived. Australia also has some giant mammal invaders of its own, with the majority of them looking very out of place. Famously, the Europeans brought camels here to aid in transport and to help move things around, but after they served their purpose, they were simply let go. If you head to the Northern Territory, you can find a critically endangered and beautiful bovid in the banteng, and this is one of the rare examples of an animal that's invasive yet endangered across its native range. Even though these mammals are giant and powerful with a maximum weight of around 900 kilograms, they are known for being relatively shy and elusive. They are still potentially dangerous though, as they can spread deadly diseases to humans and cattle, but for the most part they're pretty harmless. There's another large bovid that inhabits the same area as the banteng, and the only native animal that can take them down is the formidable saltwater crocodile. There are around 200,000 feral water buffalo in northern Australia, and for the most part they don't really have an interest in approaching or hurting humans. Because of the massive negative effects that they have on the Australian ecosystem, there have been many attempts to try and control the water buffalo populations in the country, and this is where they can become dangerous. Large water buffalo can weigh over a metric ton, and when they feel threatened, they can really throw their weight around. One man was killed by a water buffalo in Australia all the way back in 2005, and another was killed later on in 2016. Thankfully, fatal cases in Australia remain rare, but this giant bovid means that Oceania is fit for the third place spot. Because many of Africa's ecosystems are so harsh and are full of formidable animals, it should come as no surprise that it has a relatively small number of invasive species compared to other continents. Most of its invaders are found in its waters or in its urban areas, and that's definitely the case for the animal that we'll be focusing on. Feral dogs have become a real problem in a few different continents around the globe, and their adaptability and intelligence allows them to survive in human-inhabited areas. You might be wondering why I haven't already included the feral dog in some of the other sections in this video, and that's because the dog is technically a subspecies of wolf, and the grey wolf is native to Eurasia and North America. There are a few different canids in Africa that are called wolves, such as the African wolf and the Ethiopian wolf, but these canids are not the same species as the grey wolf, which all dogs are descended from. That's why I believe that it's okay to include them in this section, and they are one of the most dangerous invasive species in Africa. Now, feral dogs attacking and killing people in Africa is extremely rare, but of course they are spreaders of rabies, which still remains as one of the deadliest diseases in the world. Across most of the Western world, rabies is very rare, but in Africa and some parts of Asia, it's a real problem. Around 59,000 people die from rabies annually worldwide, and around 21,000 to 25,000 people die from dog-transmitted rabies in Africa each year. It's one of those terrifying diseases that reminds you how fragile life is, because once symptoms appear, the result is virtually always death. In the summer of 2025, a British woman died after being scratched by a puppy in Morocco, and it's worrying that this is all it takes to contract this fatal disease. There are many ongoing vaccination efforts across Africa to try and tackle rabies, but as there are an estimated 70 million feral dogs across the continent, it seems almost impossible to fully control it. So even though it's not really their fault and they are suffering too, the feral dog is the deadliest invasive species in Africa, and they slot Africa in at the second place spot. Just like Africa, South America has a relatively small number of invasive species, but there are a few that have caused massive problems. In Tierra del Fuego, American beavers have destroyed and permanently changed many of its iconic landscapes, and introduced trout and salmon have had massive negative effects on native fish populations. There are also a few invaders that pose a risk to human lives, such as the aforementioned wild boar and the giant African land snail. These snails might not appear to be a particularly dangerous animal at first, but if eaten, they can transmit deadly diseases and parasites. It's hard to get an accurate number of how many people have lost their lives after eating these snails across South America, but there have been nearly 100 documented cases in Ecuador alone. The deadliest invasive species in South America doesn't kill people through transmitting diseases and parasites, as instead it decides to charge at them and throw them into the air. Now, I've been through the story of how hippos made it to South America way too many times, so I'll keep it very brief. Basically, Pablo Escobar kept some of them on his properties as pets, and after he died, some were transported away and others found their way into the wild. To Today there are around 170 of them in Colombia, and even though they haven't claimed a human life yet, they have come very close. Hippos are one of the deadliest animals in Africa, being responsible for around 500 human deaths each year. They are known for being incredibly unpredictable, and one Colombian fisherman learned this the hard way back in 2021. There have also been a few other attacks, but thankfully none of them have been fatal so far, and tragically one of these hippos was killed after being hit by a car. The government is really struggling to figure out a way to deal with this problem, as sterilizing them is proving to be very expensive, and tracking them down and transporting them is almost impossible. Hopefully a solution can be found in the future, as it's very likely that they could claim a human life as the years go on. The deadly hippo means that South America takes the first place spot, and really no other continent comes close. I decided not to focus on the numbers alone in this video, as there are many factors that can affect how many people are killed by a certain animal. But if you have any suggestions for animals that I should have featured, then feel free to let me know. But for now, that's about it for this video. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.